Alrighty, welcome back to Shut Up and Ball. I am Aaron Chow, accompanied by my co-host John Harris. As always, we're back today to go over the AFC South and their off seasons and previewing their season for the upcoming 2024-2025 season, as well as going over our top 5 centers, so finishing offense, our offensive rankings, and then starting on defense. We'll also be doing our top 5 interior defensive linemen, or defensive tackles per se, rankings as well. So that will be fun and interesting as always, because especially the center one tends to be a tough one, as well as defensive tackle. But nonetheless, John, let's dive into it. Starting with the Houston Texans. Surprisingly, as people remember last year, and I think I definitely was. We both felt that. Neither one of us probably thought that Texans were gonna even sniff the playoffs. Figured it would be another rebuilding year.
Yeah.
And nonetheless, they're the only team to make it into the playoffs, and I don't think anyone had it on their bingo cards that they would win the division and, of course, make the playoffs. But they did nonetheless. They were 10-7 last year. And then in terms of losses/departures, they lost running back Devin Singletary, who filled in nicely for them. And on the offensive line, that was shuffled around a bit. Lost guard Michael Dieter, and then tackles George Fant and Josh Jones. And then on the defensive side of the ball, lost defensive tackles Malik Collins and Sheldon Rankins. And also lost edge rusher Jonathan Greenard. And then also lost linebackers Denzel Perryman and Blake Cashman. And then in the secondary, lost cornerback Steven Nelson and safeties Kareem Jackson and Adrian Amos. So, but in terms of additions, they went and grabbed running back Joe Mixon and obviously traded for wide receiver Stephon Diggs from the Bills, and also added wide receiver Ben Skowronek from the LA Rams. And then on defense, went and got edge rusher Danielle Hunter to kind of obviously supplant the loss of Greenard, and then as well as edge Denico Autry, and then they also grabbed linebacker Azeez Al-Shaair, who, if I remember correctly, was in Tennessee, but also spent some time in San Francisco, so that's that familiarity there. And then in the draft, in the second round, they went cornerback Kamari Lassiter from Georgia, and then later in the second round went tackle Blake Fisher out of Notre Dame, and then in the third round they went with safety Kalen Bullock out of USC. So, obviously, like I mentioned at the top, much different expectations this year as opposed to going into last year for these Texans. So, John, do you believe that they can live up to the hype, or maybe this will be a little bit of a coming back to earth for them?
I mean, for the Texans, ultimately, somewhat similar of a point that I've made, for example, about your Green Bay Packers. There's just a lot of young pieces on this team that I'm very excited to see develop. CJ Stroud in his rookie year looked fantastic. I mean, we both had him in our top 10 quarterback list. That's insane to accomplish in your rookie season, and that's really how good he was. I mean, like you said, neither of us really expected them to make the playoffs last year, and that was despite the fact that we were both incredibly high on CJ Stroud. We both thought that he was the QB1 in that class, and he exceeded our expectations immediately. Like, we definitely thought this was probably a potential scenario for his career that he could reach, and he did it in year 1. So I'm excited to see how he looks in year 2. You got a guy like Nico Collins, who had a fantastic year last year. It was his third season. His first 2 years were kind of lackluster, whether it be due to injury or, the previous quarterback situation or, what have you. All of a sudden last year, he breaks out for 1,300 yards. Tank Dell looked fantastic at points during the year. He got injured, but he's going to be coming back from that. You got some other young guys on the offensive line like Kenyon Green, who I'm still excited to see continue to develop. Will Anderson Jr. on the defensive side. We thought it was a little bit of a reach to trade up and devote, your future first-round pick to getting Will Anderson. But the expectation at the time was that Houston would not be a playoff team, and so that pick would be higher than it was. So the fact that they were able to get a player of Will Anderson's caliber, considering the rookie year he had and the fact that he was a top 5 pick, and they basically traded a future pick that was, a playoff team selection. I'm excited to see how he does. That was clearly great value in that trade for them. So there's just a lot of young options that I really like that I'm excited to see continue to develop. And then, like you mentioned, in some of the additions they brought in, they clearly saw this team with the young pieces we have is close. Like the fact that we were able to make the playoffs year one, win 10 games, how much better could we be? Can we challenge, some of these top dogs like the Kansas City Chiefs? So what they do is they go out and they get a ton of great veterans. Joe Mixon. I wasn't the biggest fan of him in Cincinnati purely from the fact that I do think his production is declining. But in terms of Houston, with the way that their backfield has looked over the years and not really having sort of a stable veteran, I like it because then behind him, you still have Dameon Pierce, who had a promising rookie season. You still have Cam Akers, who you brought in, that maybe he can be, a potential impact player a couple more years removed from the injury. Because we've seen Cam Akers at points be, a contributor. So the running back room is interesting. I don't think it's going to light the world up, but I do think that Joe Mixon does bring a stability and a veteran presence, and at the very least is better than any of the running backs they've had over the last couple of years, quite frankly. Then you have Stephon Diggs, who, despite the fact that we both had criticisms of him at the end of last year, he's still a fantastic receiver. He's still considered a wide receiver one in terms of like the NFL and the way that teams are going to approach him and all that kind of stuff. And at the worst case, let's say he does truly sort of decline and he's not as good as he once was, and teams aren't having to focus on him like that. Well, guess what? Nico Collins had 1,300 yards last year. Tank Dell looked fantastic at points. So if Stephon Diggs is on paper your wide receiver 2 or 3, that's still a fantastic player to have there, and you can afford to do that considering that the other 2 guys are still on their rookie contracts. So I still like that addition regardless of how well he plays, because I do think that ultimately he can be an impact player for them. Then on the defensive line, we talked about Will Anderson. You go and get Danielle Hunter on the opposite side, who's one of the top edge rushers in the league. I mean, that's a scary edge rushing duo. I'm a really big fan of that addition, and ultimately, I just felt like in terms of what you have to do in the offseason for a team that is in the Houston Texans position, I think they nailed it. I think they absolutely had a home run offseason. There are certain guys that you're probably going to miss having, specifically I think on the interior of that defensive line, Sheldon Rankins and Malik Collins both leaving. But at the same time, I think they wouldn't have done that if and they wouldn't have not addressed the interior of the offensive line if they didn't believe in the guys they have coming up. And once again, when you have Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson Jr. on the edges, I really think that in terms of at least the pass rush, those guys can get there. The big concern is going to be how good can this team be, at least when it comes to stopping the run on the interior. So, yeah, I mean, I think the Houston Texans had a great offseason. I don't think that any of the guys they added are necessarily going to, maybe like outside of probably Danielle Hunter, but like Joe Mixon, Stephon Diggs, I don't know if they're going to live up to their previous primes, but I do think that in terms of how young this team is, the pieces around them, all they have to do is be solid veteran contributors, and this team, I think they got better.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, so my first concern I do want to address with them would be interior offensive line. You mentioned, though, Kenyon Green coming, maybe finally getting another year under his belt, more experience. And really, it's important to remember, too, they did all that, and a little bit of the reason why they struggled at the beginning of last season, too, not just because, Stroud's rookie year, but their offensive line was a mess. Like, they were having multiple injuries, and they had, like, multiple different combinations to start the year. Key guys like Tunzel and Titus Howard were out, and even like some of the other starters like Shaq Mason as well. So hopefully they can stay healthy. And even if they are, maybe that could be a weak point. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what year 2 of not only CJ Stroud, but also another year with in Bobby Slowick's system, because he was highly praised for the year that they had, and deservedly so. And now he has more toys to play with, like you mentioned, in the Stephon Diggs. And then obviously further development of Nico Collins and Tank Dell on top of that. And also Dalton Schultz, he wasn't amazing, but he was a very good tight end for them and a very good option as well, and served to be obviously serviceable in that spot for the offense. So, I don't have many concerns outside of that on the offense. And then defensively, I mean, you hit it really. It's just that interior defensive line, but for the most part, I mean, the other pieces around that are good. Even the depth on edge, like I don't mind Derek Barnett as your third pass rusher. We've seen he's solid. He's contributed a bit in Philly. He just wasn't amazing, but hey, he definitely has a role. And Jerry Hughes, you mentioned veterans, longtime veteran there as well on the edge.
And I
And
will
then
say, at least about Jerry Hughes, I think even like over the last couple of years, he's had like moments where he looked really good. So,
yeah,
he's not going to do it consistently like he once did when he was younger, but he can have a couple games a year where it's like, wow, Jerry Hughes is having a huge impact.
yeah, and especially maybe come playoff time as well, he could be a huge impact as well. And then even linebacker wise, bringing in Aziz Al Shair, kind of familiar with the system, but even guys within the system last year, like Christian Harris, one of their linebackers, he's out the first couple of weeks. He's on IR right now, designated to return, but he had a really good year last year, and as well as their other draft pick from last year. I may mispronounce his name, but Henry To'o. He had moments as well, kind of fitting in that system. So solid depth there, especially once Harris gets back. And I will say too, in regards to the next part, like secondary, Stingley. Hey, I was obviously wrong on him. He's stepped up since coming into the NFL and shown what he showed in that freshman year that everyone was raving about, and he's been really good on his side. And it's just a matter of, I guess the only concern I would have too would be, okay, can the others on the other side, like as of right now on ESPN, I don't know if this will be their official depth chart, but they have that rookie I mentioned, Kamari Lassiter, being on the other side of Stingley, but they also brought in your boy Jeff Okudah, who's been solid at points as well. So, be interesting to see how they can contribute. And then even at safety, like you have a young Jalen Petrie, but then Jimmy Ward, who's once again familiar with the system, a veteran, is also starting as well. So I'm sure that will help in regards to instilling that defense that D'Amico Ryans wants to run in that system. So it'll be interesting to see if they can basically just take the next step per se, or just keep going at the level they were, because kind of said this with the Lions and some of the other teams. It's a little bit harder now that you're not going to take teams by surprise this year. Teams are going to be, bringing their A game in theory, of course, but they're going to be treating you with a little more respect than they probably did last season, when, especially like I said, we all kind of expected Houston to be kind of a bit of more of a mess than it actually was. So, nonetheless, I expect them to be in the playoff conversation. Expect this to definitely be a high flying offense, and we'll see if they could live up to the expectations, and just keep building, keep making noise for Houston that they haven't had in a bit, because they've obviously had a couple of dark years of rebuilding and a little bit of dysfunction as well with the rotating head coaches there for a while too. So that is the Houston Texans.